Off the coast of Guadalcanal, a Pacific island in the Solomons chain, there is a graveyard of American and Japanese warships. They were sunk in a savage 6-month battle. Their resting place is known as Iron Bottom Sound. At sea, in the air, and on land, the struggle for Guadalcanal began a campaign which was to test the endurance and fighting skills of the US Navy and Marine Corps to the very limit. It began with an unopposed American landing and the capture of a vital airfield. Then it turned into a slogging match at sea and in the jungle as the Japanese poured in reinforcements to reclaim this vital link in their Pacific perimeter. As dawn broke on the 7th of August, 1942, the Allied South Pacific Amphibious Force approached Guadalcanal. Witness to their arrival was Martin Clemens, a member of a remarkable organization, the Coast Watchers. They were a group of Australian and British traders and planters who had stayed behind when the Japanese overran the Pacific. Clemens and colleagues like Henry Jocelyn reported enemy naval and air movements on the bulky radio sets with which they had The Coast Watchers were on the lookout for Japanese ships and aircraft, and the Japanese were on the lookout for them. Japanese patrols using bloodhounds offered large rewards for information which led to the capture of the vigilant Coast Watchers. The Coast Watchers were not the only secret organization watching the Japanese. At Station Hypo on Hawaii, US Navy cryptanalysts were reading the Japanese naval code JN-25 on a regular basis. But it was Martin Clemens who, in May 1942, had signaled the Allies that the Japanese were building an airfield on Guadalcanal. If the Japanese were allowed to complete the airfield, they would seize control of the skies in the area and menace the sea routes between the United States and Australia. The Americans had no option but to deny Guadalcanal to the Japanese. Martin Clemens' dramatic message had set the scene for one of the epic sea-air-land battles of the Pacific War. It would be a fight to the finish. The conflict in the Pacific had begun disastrously for the Americans when, without declaring war, the Japanese launched carrier-borne aircraft against the naval base at Pearl Harbor. The Japanese had sunk or disabled 7 of the 8 battleships berthed at Pearl Harbor. But the US Pacific Fleet's carriers were at sea and escaped destruction. Before Pearl Harbor, the commander of the Japanese Combined Fleet, Admiral Yamamoto, had warned Emperor Hirohito that if Japan went to war with the United States, he could guarantee only 6 months of victory. Yamamoto planned to lure the Pacific Fleet into a decisive encounter with an attack on the American-held island of Midway, which was equidistant from the Japanese home islands and Pearl Harbor. Midway was the keyhole through which American warships could still pass. In April 1942, it had admitted the American carrier Hornet, which had launched an air raid on the Japanese home islands led by Colonel James Doolittle. The American bombers had inflicted little damage on Japanese war industry. But several of them had flown directly over the Imperial Palace. They had orders not to drop bombs, but the implicit threat to the life of the Emperor, whom the Japanese regarded as divine, had a seismic effect on their military high command. it decided to close the Midway keyhole once and for all. The plans for the capture of Midway, until then the subject of heated debate in the Imperial Navy, were approved and brought forward. Yamamoto was confident of success. Victory at Midway would tighten the Japanese grip on their Pacific Empire. At this stage in the war, the Japanese were in the grip of what they would later call victory disease. The colonial powers in the Far East, the Dutch and the British and their American ally, had been humbled. But the Americans had the most important card of all up their sleeve. The breaking of JN-25 had given the American codebreakers a ringside seat at the formulation of Japanese strategy. The decryption of coded naval signals had revealed Japanese plans to strike at Port Moresby in New Guinea, so as to complete their conquest of the island. The commander of the U.S. Pacific Fleet, Admiral Chester W. Nimitz, dispatched the carriers Lexington and Yorktown to position themselves in the Coral Sea, so as to intercept any Japanese forces attacking Port Moresby. The Japanese invasion force from Rabaul was covered by 3 aircraft carriers. On the 8th of May, each side located the other's carrier forces. The Battle of the Coral Sea was the first carrier versus carrier battle in naval history. Lexington was set ablaze by a leak in her aviation fuel lines and had to be abandoned. But the Americans hit back by disabling the Japanese carrier Shokaku. Tactically, the battle was a victory for the Japanese. However, they were forced to abandon their attempt to seize Port Moresby, and the threat to Australia was removed. The battle also convinced the American carrier force that it was the equal of the Japanese. The Japanese now put their Midway plan, codenamed MI, into action. A diversionary attack was to be launched against the Aleutians in the north, while the Japanese First Air Fleet, commanded by Admiral Nagumo, concentrated against Midway. Meanwhile, the battle went to hasty repairs at Pearl Harbor before rejoining Task Force 17 under the command of Admiral Frank J. Fletcher. Admiral Fletcher was a cautious commander who was only too aware of the need to safeguard America's small but vital carrier fleet. Yorktown sailed to join Hornet and Enterprise, which formed the core of Task Force 16, under the command of Admiral Raymond A. Spruance. At this stage in his career, Spruance was inexperienced in carrier warfare. Both Spruance and Fletcher knew that the odds were stacked against them. The Japanese First Air Fleet fielded 6 large carriers, of which 4 had been allocated to the Midway operation. When battle was joined, 180 American aircraft would face 270 Japanese. For all the emerging fighting skills of the American carriers and their air groups, these were daunting odds. The equalizer in this equation was the American access to the Japanese naval code JN-25. Moves of the Midway campaign, Japanese radio security gave little away. The operation itself was designated MI, which might have meant anything, in spite of the implied reference to Midway Island. In the Japanese plan, Midway itself, little more than an atoll with a small marine garrison supported by an air component, was designated AF. The man in charge of Station Hypo, the brilliant cryptanalyst Commander Joseph Rochefort, was convinced that Midway was the target. But U.S. Fleet Commander-in-Chief Admiral Ernest J. King believed that the First Air Fleet was about to strike at the west coast of America. So Rochefort decided to set a trap. On a secure telegraphic link, he instructed the American garrison on Midway to radio in clear that it was running out of fresh water. The Japanese swallowed the bait. Shortly after Midway had requested fresh supplies of water, an Australian antenna of Rochefort's network intercepted a Japanese cipher transmission which indicated that AF had reported that it was short of water. Rochefort's ruse had revealed the target. Subsequent intercepts indicated that the operation designated MI would start on the 4th of June. The American carriers were in position to intercept the First Air Fleet when it launched its attack on Midway. The Japanese were to be taken completely by surprise. They thought the enemy carriers were on the other side of the Pacific. The first Japanese strike on the island failed to destroy all its targets. The aircraft returned to their carriers to refuel, rearm, and complete their task. But then the fate of the Imperial Japanese Navy was decided within the space of exactly 5 minutes on the morning of the 4th of June, 1942. In those fatal 5 minutes, dauntless dive bombers from Yorktown and Enterprise found, attacked, and destroyed 3 of the First Air Fleet's carriers. The First Air Fleet had ceased to exist. With the carriers went the Japanese dream of empire. The Japanese struck back. Aircraft from their surviving carrier, Hiryu, disabled Yorktown. The carrier was abandoned and later sunk by a Japanese submarine. But Hiryu did not survive for long. As dusk approached, she too was found and wrecked by American dive and torpedo bombers. Yamamoto's prophecy of 6 months of victory had been fulfilled almost to the day. But Yamamoto knew that the Japanese losses could never be made good. The initiative now lay with the Americans. Although they had not lost a single foot of territory, the Japanese would now be forced to defend a vast ocean empire which might be attacked at any point by the gathering might of the American war machine. The Americans had to choose the axis along which to advance. To reach Japan's home islands, they could either strike in the south through the Solomons, New Guinea, and the Philippines, or they could mount a drive through the Central Pacific aimed at the island of Okinawa. But between the home islands and the American jumping-off points lay a daunting chain of Japanese-held island fortresses, blocking an amphibious advance. The choice of route depended on agreement between the Navy commander in the Pacific, Admiral Nimitz, and General Douglas MacArthur, commander of the Army forces in the Southwest Pacific with his headquarters in Australia. The choice of a northern route to Japan would increase the importance of the Navy at the expense of MacArthur. But the small Marine Corps was Nimitz's only military arm. Nor had the Navy yet developed the specialist assault craft and fleet trains to send it striding across the Pacific. In contrast, the Army had the men who were arriving in numbers in Australia. The route through the Southwest Pacific, with a jumping-off point near Australia, would carry the Army through larger islands, yielding some of the resources needed to sustain the offensive. This route would also need less of the presently overstretched shipping services. But the southern route would emphasize the Army's role at the expense of the Navy, and the brilliant but overbearing MacArthur was not popular with the Naval High Command. They feared that in these circumstances he would usurp the overall direction of strategy. At the beginning of July, after much haggling, a compromise was reached. The initial emphasis would be on the southern route. But the area would be subdivided, giving certain parts to MacArthur and the Army, and others to Nimitz and the Navy. MacArthur would have only a limited call on the Navy's carriers and bombardment fleet. Uncharacteristically, he would have to take a back seat for Task 1, which was the capture of Guadalcanal by the Navy. Guadalcanal could be safely approached from New Zealand, the starting point for the operation, codenamed Watchtower. but it was surrounded on three sides by other islands in the Solomons Group. Together, they formed a cramped channel which was to become known to the Americans as the Slot. On the 7th of August, the men of the 1st Marine Division waded ashore on Tulagi and Guadalcanal, just a few miles east of the Japanese airfield. On Guadalcanal, the Japanese had been taken by surprise. The landings were unopposed. This was fortunate, since the beaches rapidly descended into chaos as men, munitions, and stores arrived in completely haphazard fashion. But on Tulagi, and nearby Tanambogo and Gavutu, the Americans ran into furious opposition from the Japanese garrisons. It was an ominous sign of things to come. It took a fearsome bombardment from the task force warships to drive the defenders from their positions. Within 36 hours, the Marines had taken the Japanese airfield, which was renamed Henderson Field after a Marine pilot who had died at Midway. For the next 6 months, the battle for Guadalcanal would boil down to the battle for Henderson Field. The Marines would soon be deprived of the air cover provided by Fletcher's carriers. Anxious about the losses his fighter force had already sustained, Fletcher decided to withdraw his ships. These included Saratoga, Wasp, and Enterprise. Fletcher was backed by Admiral Richmond K. Turner, the amphibious force commander, who had also decided to pull out. Vandergrift and the Marines were now left on Guadalcanal on their own. They dug in around Henderson Field to await the inevitable Japanese counterattack. By mid-afternoon on the 7th of August, a force of 7 Japanese cruisers, commanded by Mikawa, was racing towards Guadalcanal. The encoded signal ordering Mikawa to sail from Rabaul had been intercepted, but was not deciphered for another week. The Americans had lost their intelligence edge. For their part, the Japanese were supremely confident. Lacking radar, they were trained to fight night actions with their long-lance torpedoes. Mikawa's objective was the American transports lying in Iron Bottom Sound. His cruiser force attacked south of Savo Island, avoiding 2 U.S. force under the Royal Navy's Admiral Crutchley, was divided into a southern group of 3 cruisers, and a northern group also facing both possible approaches. Crutchley, however, was attending a conference to discuss the withdrawal of the carriers. He had not informed his senior captain that he was now in command of the screening force. His flagship, the cruiser Canberra, was only minutes away from disaster. When Mikawa rounded Savo Island and encountered the Allied southern group, the result was fatal confusion. Illuminated by Japanese flares, Canberra was hit by a hail of gunfire. Then Chicago was raked by fire and hit by a long-lance torpedo. In less than 10 furious minutes, Mikawa had put the southern screening group out of action. Somehow, Canberra remained afloat until the next morning, when her crew were taken off. Mikawa and the transports. But fearing attacks from American carrier-borne aircraft at first light, he did not press on. This proved to be one of the most fateful decisions of the Guadalcanal campaign, and one which earned Mikawa the personal censure. The Japanese infantry had been landed on Guadalcanal by ships commanded by Admiral Tanaka. This was the first in a long succession of runs which the Americans were to dub the Tokyo Express. By now, the Japanese had switched codes again, moving on to JN-25D on the 4th. They were also planning another run of the Tokyo Express, but this time as part of an elaborate trap set for the Pacific Fleet by no less a person than Admiral Yamamoto. Independent of the Express, but coordinated with it, would sail a powerful striking force of battleships, cruisers and destroyers, escorting the carriers Zuikaku and Shokaku. Intended to lure Admiral Frank Fletcher's Task Force 61 into revealing itself, so that it could be destroyed by aircraft from Yamamoto's powerful striking force. Now Fletcher's force braced itself for the enemy response. He had dispatched the strike which sank Ryujo with no fighter escort. Overhead, he had 53 fighters stacked in 3 layers, waiting for the attack he knew must come. All Fletcher's remaining dive and torpedo bomber crews had taken off to find and attack the Japanese fleet. Saratoga and Enterprise waited, every gun manned and loaded. When the Japanese aircraft arrived, the American fighters beat off the enemy torpedo bombers and their escorts. But about 30 dive bombers arrived undetected over Enterprise. She was hit by 3 bombs, 2 of which crashed into the carrier's vitals before exploding. Enterprise lay dead in the water for some time before limping off to safety. Meanwhile, aircraft from Saratoga had hit and badly damaged the seaplane carrier Chitose. The next day, Marine Corps aircraft flying from Henderson Field attacked Tanaka's transports and hit his flagship Jinsu. Henceforth, the Tokyo Express would only run at night. Nightly runs of the Tokyo Express fed in more Japanese reinforcements, and warships shelled the marine positions around Henderson Field. Vandergrift was beginning to lose the numbers war on Guadalcanal. The Americans stepped up their own reinforcement runs, and on the 15th of September, the battleship North Carolina formed part of the escort for a convoy bringing in 4,000 men of the 7th Marines. The troops were landed safely, but on the way out, the convoy's other major element, the carrier Wasp, was torpedoed and sunk by a Japanese submarine. By the end of September, the Japanese High Command had finally grasped the importance of the battle for Guadalcanal. They also kept a grip on their signal security. They rang the changes on JN-25 and began a wholesale overhaul of their communication system. The American codebreakers, who'd been feeling their way back into JN-25, were once again forced to rely on traffic analysis. Conditions on Guadalcanal were appalling. The landing beaches clogged with the detritus of war. The fetid jungle alive with leeches and disease. The Japanese resolve to wrest Guadalcanal from the Marines was confirmed on the 9th of October with the arrival on the island of the commander of 17th Army, General Hyakutake, to take personal charge of the campaign. On the night of the 11th of October, the Americans and the Japanese made simultaneous landings on Guadalcanal. This led to another night battle west of Savo Island. A heavy cruiser task force commanded by Admiral Norman Scott took the Japanese by surprise. At the end of a confused and bitterly fought encounter, Scott was able to claim victory, proof that the Japanese were no longer invincible by night. Exploiting his advantage in radar, Scott had been able to maul the escort accompanying the Tokyo Express. In the dark, the Americans were no longer all at sea, although they lost a destroyer and one of Scott's heavy cruisers was badly battered. But Scott had not prevented the landing of new artillery. The struggle for Guadalcanal was nearing a new crisis. Henderson Field now came under bombardment, cruising in Iron Bottom Sound. Meanwhile, the American codebreakers were back in business. In mid-October, they warned of a fresh concentration of Japanese transports, cruisers and carriers in the Solomons area. At the same time, the Japanese ground strength on the island matched that of the Marines. A fresh Japanese offensive, launched on the 24th of October, nearly broke through to Henderson Field. At one point, all that stood between the Japanese and Henderson Field was a single machine gun, manned by Sergeant John Basilone of the 1st Battalion, 7th Marines. It was enough to deny the Japanese their prize. At Pearl Harbor, Admiral Nimitz was keenly aware that the Navy had not secured the waters around Guadalcanal. He warned his staff that he wanted no gloom or defeatism. Nimitz declared that the enemy is hurt too, but our job is to provide the fighting men with everything they need on Guadalcanal to fight this battle. We aren't going to do any good sitting here moaning or wringing our hands. The hard-driving Admiral William Bull Halsey was appointed C&C South Pacific. Fletcher, who'd been wounded in action, was replaced by Admiral Thomas Kincaid. By now, virtually the entire Japanese combined fleet, 5 carriers, 4 battleships, 10 cruisers and 29 destroyers, had sailed southward from Truk for a colossal bombardment and blockade operation. American cryptanalysts intensified their warnings of another Japanese offensive, although they could not pinpoint the precise date and location of the thrust. But Guadalcanal seemed to be the most likely objective. His fleet now deployed north of the Solomons. In Yamamoto's words, his warships were waiting to apprehend and annihilate any powerful forces in the area. Yamamoto again exercised overall command from the giant battleship Yamato at Truk in the Carolines group of islands. While the fighting swung to and fro around Henderson Field, the Japanese twice postponed the offensive, but time was running out for Yamamoto. The Japanese delay enabled the newly repaired Enterprise to complete the voyage from Pearl Harbor. She rendezvoused with Kinkaid's task force and the carrier Hornet to patrol northeast of the Santa Cruz Islands. Bearing down on them were a Japanese advance force tasked with attacking Henderson Field, and a powerful striking force of 3 large carriers under Admiral Nagumo, with orders to locate and destroy the American carriers. The scene was set for a potentially decisive carrier battle. After reconnaissance planes from both fleets had located their targets, the Japanese and American strike forces took off. Incredibly, the 2 strike forces passed within sight of each other. A handful of Japanese fighters peeled off to engage their American counterparts, but the rest flew on towards their distant targets. Shortly after 9 a.m., the Americans attacked the enemy carriers. There were direct hits on Shakaku and Zuiho. The Japanese escorts also came under fire. Within 10 minutes, the Americans were also under attack. Hornet was hit by bombs and torpedoes, and in a sinister new development, the carrier was also the target of 2 Japanese suicide planes. A second enemy wave scored more hits on Enterprise. A third damaged the cruiser San Juan. Enterprise was still able to take on aircraft, and Kinkaid decided to break off the action. The battleship South Dakota had also been hit by Japanese aircraft, but lived to fight another day. Hornet had not been so lucky. Now a wreck, she was abandoned and sunk the next day by Japanese destroyers. The Japanese had won a tactical victory, but they could not afford many more like it. They had lost 97 aircraft and 148 irreplaceable aircrew, including a high proportion of veteran squadron and section commanders. The Americans could afford their losses, but Admiral Nagumo's dead airmen were gone forever. Not prepared to concede defeat on Guadalcanal. In the first 2 weeks of November, their destroyers ran in thousands more troops. Now they outnumbered the Marines on the island. Traffic analysis and the fitful braking of JN-25 had once again painted a partial picture of Japanese intentions. The Americans steeled themselves to face another maximum enemy effort. Yamamoto planned another action at sea to coincide with a drive by his land forces on Henderson Field, now littered with wrecked aircraft, but still defiantly operational. Yamamoto issued his orders on the 8th of November. Within 24 hours, they had been largely decoded and were on the desk of Admiral Halsey. The Americans now anticipated a renewed assault on Guadalcanal and a drive on Henderson Field on the 12th of November. Halsey was given more details on the 10th, but he didn't know the size of Yamamoto's force, nor was he aware of Yamamoto's plans to bombard Henderson Field. The bulletin issued by Halsey on the 10th of November stated, "Big Japanese offensive against Guadalcanal to begin soon. Believe enemy striking force intends to hit that place, followed by attempted landings by army units from transports." At sea, Admiral Kondo, flying his flag in the heavy cruiser Otago, commanded a formidable advance force of 2 battleships, 6 cruisers, and 21 destroyers. They were accompanied by a bombardment group of 2 battleships, a light cruiser and destroyers, and another support group drawn from 8th Fleet of cruisers and destroyers. Bearing down on Guadalcanal was a far larger force than the Americans anticipated. But in one vital respect, the Japanese were under strength. 3 carriers were on their way back to the home islands for repairs and fresh air crews. Only the carrier Junyo was at sea with Kondo. Halsey was in no better shape. He had only 1 carrier, Enterprise, undergoing repairs in New Caledonia, the battleships Washington and South Dakota, 8 cruisers and 22 destroyers. But Halsey had no intention of avoiding battle. He ordered Kincaid to sail on the 11th of November and be prepared to strike at enemy targets in the Guadalcanal area. Kondo's fleet positioned itself 150 miles north of Guadalcanal. The bombardment force was dispatched to shell Henderson Field, while Admiral Tanaka landed reinforcements at Tasafaronga Point, northwest of the American beachhead. On the night of the 12th of November, the bombardment force collided head-on with the Americans in Iron Bottom Sound, southeast of Savo Island. Another night battle ensued. Admiral Scott, aboard his flagship Atlanta, was killed, along with most of his senior commanders, when a shell from the battleship Hiei smashed into Atlanta's bridge. San Francisco's bridge was raked with fire by Kirishima, claiming the life of Admiral Callahan. Meanwhile, 8 American destroyers had joined a deadly duel with Hiei, closing to a range at which the battleship could not bring its heavy guns to bear. Hit more than 50 times, Hiei limped away. Kirishima also withdrew. The Japanese later scuttled Hiei, the first of their battleships to go down in the war. At sunset on the 14th of November, the American battleships Washington and South Dakota intercepted the 2nd Japanese force under Admiral Kondo as it sailed eastward through the Solomon Sea to bombard Henderson Field. Long Lance torpedoes put 3 of the Americans' 4 destroyer escorts out of action. Then Kirishima crippled South Dakota. Moving in for the kill, Kirishima was engaged by Washington at a range of 5 miles. Washington opened fire by radar. Hit by a succession of broadsides, Kirishima was set ablaze and abandoned. Kondo, in the cruiser Tagao, sailed away at full speed. Meanwhile, Kincaid's task force, including the wounded Enterprise, was heading north to engage Tanaka's convoy. Carrier-borne aircraft sank 7 of the Japanese transports. When the 4 survivors were grounded at Tasafaronga the next day, they were pounded by American dive bombers and artillery. The Tokyo Express had been derailed. Despite the American threat, the Express continued to mount operations. At the end of November, 8 destroyers crammed with troops got the better of a strong American cruiser force, but was unable to land any reinforcements. The Japanese now resorted to submarines to run in supplies to 17th Army. In the first week of December, they delivered 20 tons, a drop in the ocean. But once again, radio intelligence came to the aid of the Americans, giving advance warning of many of the submarine runs. On the 9th of December, radio intercepts enabled the Americans to arrange a PT boat ambush. 2 PT boats lay in wait for the submarine I-3, which obligingly surfaced between them and was sunk with a single torpedo. Victory on Guadalcanal was in sight. The Americans now held the upper hand at sea and in the air. A trickle of Japanese prisoners were giving themselves up. Many starving Japanese were killed by native villagers. Their severed heads decorated the island's longhouses for years to come. Vandergrift's battle-worn Marines were replaced by U.S. Army troops under the command of General Alexander M. Patch. Patch began to mop up. Vandergrift's dogged defense of Henderson Field had turned him into a national hero. The jealous MacArthur sourly remarked that the Marine commander clearly wanted to run for president. At their last gasp, the Japanese scored a final success. At the end of January 1943, Japanese aircraft flying from a reinforcement convoy heading for Guadalcanal in the hope of drawing Yamamoto into another battle. A torpedo sank Chicago, the sole survivor of the Battle of Savo Island. By the end of the first week in February, the Japanese had evacuated 13,000 troops from Guadalcanal. Behind them, they left 25,000 dead and barely 1,000 prisoners. On the 9th of February 1943, General Patch signaled Halsey, "The Tokyo Express no longer has a terminal." Thus began the American fightback, which was to end 3 years later in Tokyo Bay with the Japanese surrender. And today, divers still explore the secrets of Guadalcanal in the underwater cemetery in Iron Bottom Sound.
More secrets of World War II next on UK TV History, looking at the vital, dangerous role of the mine hunters. And over on Style Gardens next, total transformations from the Ground Force team.